Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Julian Sterling laughed as he tipped his vintage Cabernet over Elena Vance's hand-stitched linen dress in front of the entire board. The deep red liquid bloomed across the cream fabric like a fresh wound, the scent of fermented oak and expensive tannins filling the air. For a heartbeat, the only sound on the terrace was the rhythmic splash of the fountain and the collective intake of breath from the 20 directors gathered for the Sterling family's annual spring gala. "Oh, Elena," he sneered, his voice loud enough to carry to the edge of the manicured lawn. "I'm so sorry. I forgot you weren't used to being around anything that didn't come from a bargain bin. You look like you've finally been bled, which is the only way you'd ever contribute anything of value to this family." Elena Vance stood perfectly still. The wine was cold, a shocking contrast to the humid evening air, and she could feel the dampness seeping through the silk slip beneath her dress. She didn't gasp. She didn't reach for a napkin. She simply looked at him, her gaze as steady as the mountain ridges she'd called home for the last 7 years. Margaret Sterling watched from a few feet away, her lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. She didn't offer a word of comfort or a sharp rebuke to her son. Instead, she adjusted her diamond brooch and turned back to Arthur Sterling, who sat in his wheelchair, his eyes clouded with a mix of confusion and fading regret. Beside them, Silas Thorne, the family's newly hired soil scientist, narrowed his eyes, his hand tightening around his own glass as he watched the display. "It's just a dress, Julian," Elena said, her voice low and resonant. "But that rug you're standing on, it's a Persian silk antique. My father bought it for Arthur 30 years ago. I'd be more worried about the stain you're leaving on his legacy than the one you've left on me." Julian's face flushed a mottled purple. He took a step closer, invading her space, the smell of gin and unearned confidence radiating from him. "Don't you dare speak his name. You're a footnote, Elena." "A mistake my father made when he was too soft-hearted to see a scavenger for what she was. You've crawled back here with your little brat, thinking there's a seat for you at this table. You're a gardener, a weed puller." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "And what will Leo Vance become? A stable boy, a servant for my children to kick around. He's got your common blood, after all." The mention of her son sent a spark of ice through Elena's veins, but she didn't let it reach her face. She reached into the small, hidden pocket of her ruined dress and felt the cool, jagged edge of an iron key. It was the key to the Vance Conservatory, the glass-walled sanctuary at the edge of the estate that Julian had tried, and failed, to have demolished 3 times. He thought it was a crumbling relic of a dead lineage. He didn't know that the floorboards hid the original ledgers of the Sterling holdings, or that the soil in the planters was dying because of the chemical runoff from Julian's illegal land-clearing projects. "Leo is a Vance," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made Julian blink. "He knows the value of things that grow. You only know the value of things you can burn." She turned her head slightly, catching the eye of Silas. He gave a microscopic nod, a silent confirmation that the samples had been taken. Julian was so blinded by his own performative cruelty that he hadn't noticed the man he'd hired to beautify the land was actually documenting its destruction. "You're pathetic," Julian spat, turning to the board members who were now awkwardly shifting their weight. "See, no class, no fire, she just stands there and takes it. That's the Vance way, isn't it? Docile, poor, irrelevant." He signaled to a waiter for another drink, dismissing her with a flick of his manicured hand. The board members began to murmur, their loyalty swaying back toward the man who held the purse strings, despite the foulness of his character. They saw a woman in a stained dress. They didn't see the predator who had just walked into her own trap. Elena walked away from the terrace, the wet fabric of her skirt clinging to her legs. She bypassed the main house, moving toward the shadows of the old garden where the scent of crushed rosemary and damp earth rose to meet her. Every step was a calculation. Julian needed her signature to finalize the sale of the Northern Ridge, the land he'd already secretly leveraged to pay off his mounting gambling debts. He thought he could bully her into submission, just as he had everyone else in his orbit. She stopped at the edge of the woods and pulled a burner phone from her clutch. She dialed a number she'd memorized weeks ago. "It's Elena," she said when the line clicked open. "He did it, in front of the entire board. The arrogance is at its peak." She listened for a moment, her eyes fixed on the lights of the Sterling mansion, which looked like a sinking ship against the black horizon. "No," she said, her voice as sharp as a pruning shear. "Don't move yet. Let him think he's won. Let him spend the money he doesn't have. I want him to feel the height of the mountain before I show him how far the drop is." She hung up and looked down at the red stain on her dress. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was a countdown. The next time Julian Sterling tried to pour something over her, it wouldn't be wine. It would be the consequences of every lie he'd ever told. Elena Vance turned toward the dark conservatory, the iron key heavy in her hand. The game hadn't even begun, and Julian had already lost everything he thought he owned. The next morning, the mist clung to the glass panes of the Vance conservatory like a shroud, blurring the vibrant greens of the rare herbs within. Elena Vance stood at the center of the humid space, her fingers tracing the serrated edge of a ghost orchid leaf. Beside her, Sila's Thorn adjusted the settings on a digital soil sensor, his brow furrowed as he analyzed the data. The quiet was intentional, a brief sanctuary before the inevitable storm, but it was shattered by the aggressive roar of an engine and the spray of gravel against the greenhouse foundation. A silver Porsche screeched to a halt just yards from the door, the oily, metallic tang of its exhaust seeping through the vents and poisoning the sweet scent of crushed rosemary. Julian Sterling stepped out, his Italian leather loafers clicking sharply against the stone path with a rhythmic arrogance. He didn't knock. He simply shoved the door open, letting the cool morning air collide with the carefully maintained warmth of the sanctuary. "Still playing in the dirt, I see," Julian said, his voice dripping with a casual contempt that made the air feel thin. He didn't look at the plants. He looked at the mud on Elena's boots, his lip curling in a sneer that suggested she was a blight on the landscape. "I expected you to be packing. After last night's little performance at the board meeting, I thought even you would have the sense to realize when you've been outclassed." Elena didn't look up. She kept her focus on the soil, her movements slow and deliberate. "The soil remembers everything, Julian. It doesn't care about titles or bank accounts. It only cares about what's been buried." Julian laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the glass walls. He stepped forward, his polished shoe coming down hard on a tray of germinating seedlings she had spent weeks nurturing. He ground his heel into the delicate sprouts, twisting it until the green was reduced to a dark, unrecognizable smear against the black plastic. "What's buried is the past, and the past is worthless, just like this property. Those were for the local clinic," Sila's Thorn said, his voice low and dangerous. Julian didn't even glance at him. He kept his eyes on Elena, leaning in until she could smell the expensive, cloying scent of his cologne, something heavy with sandalwood and unearned confidence. "I've already spoken to Margaret Sterling. She agrees that the family legacy is better served by a luxury resort than a crumbling greenhouse. And as for Leo Vance, well, a boy his age shouldn't be raised by a mother who's more interested in weeds than wealth. He's starting to look as ragged as these plants." Elena's hand tightened around the trowel, her knuckles turning white. The mention of her son was a spark in a room full of gasoline, but she didn't explode. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and felt the cold, jagged teeth of the iron key she'd taken from the mansion. It was a sensory anchor, a reminder that she held the lock to his undoing. "You're very concerned about wealth today," Elena said, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were as calm as a frozen lake. "Especially for a man who spent 3 hours on the phone with the Grandview Casino's credit department yesterday afternoon." The color didn't leave Julian's face immediately. It curdled. His smirk faltered, his posture stiffening as if he'd been struck. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The Obsidian account," she whispered, stepping closer until the power dynamic shifted, her quiet intensity overriding his loud bravado. "The one Arthur Sterling doesn't know about. The one you've been using to cover the margins on your failed tech investments. It's a very deep hole, Julian, deeper than any grave you could dig for me. He recoiled as if she were venomous, his hand instinctively going to his silk tie. For a moment, the entitlement vanished, replaced by a flicker of raw, panicked calculation. He looked at Sila's, then back to Elena, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. "You have nothing," he hissed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You're a gardener, a charity case." "I'm the person who knows where the bodies are," she replied, her voice as smooth as silk. "And the harvest is coming early this year." Julian turned on his heel, stumbling slightly on the gravel as he retreated toward his car. "Friday," he shouted over his shoulder, regaining a shred of his mask as he reached the door. "The final sale is Friday. By sunset, I'll have the bulldozers here to level this entire pathetic life of yours." He slammed the car door, the engine screaming as he sped away. Elena watched the dust settle, her heart hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the crushed seedlings under his footprint, then up at the calendar pinned to the potting bench. 4 days. She had exactly 4 days to ensure that when the bulldozers arrived, Julian Sterling would be the one standing in their path. She picked up her phone and dialed Silas's contact at the Environmental Agency. "It's time," she said. "Tell them the soil samples are ready for the state lab." The following afternoon, the sterile interior of the mobile research unit smelled of ozone and industrial-grade disinfectant, a sharp, biting contrast to the scent of crushed mint and damp cedar that usually clung to Elena Vance. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the digital display as Sila's Thorn calibrated the final sensor. The hum of the centrifuge was a low, vibrating drone that seemed to rattle her very teeth. Sila's didn't look up as he tapped a final command into the keyboard. "The results are consistent across all 12 quadrants, Elena. This isn't just accidental runoff from the old mill." He finally turned, his face etched with a grim professional heavy-heartedness. He handed her a printed report, the paper still warm from the machine. "It's a deliberate injection. High concentrations of arsenic and lead-based stabilizers concentrated directly into the aquifer beneath your garden. Someone didn't just want the land. They wanted to ensure nothing living could ever take root here again." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She touched the edge of the paper, her fingers grazing the jagged peaks of the toxicity graphs. This was the weapon Julian had used, a slow, silent poison to devalue her family's legacy so he could snatch it up for pennies. It wasn't just greed, it was an execution of the earth itself. "Does this link back to the Sterling accounts?" she asked, her voice a low, steady blade. "The chemical signatures match the waste profile of Sterling Industrial's 2018 manufacturing line," Silas confirmed, his eyes narrowing. "The stuff they claimed was safely processed at the state facility. Julian signed the disposal manifests himself." The heavy metal door of the trailer suddenly groaned on its hinges, swinging open with a violent clang that echoed through the small space. Julian Sterling stood in the doorway, the harsh afternoon sun silhouetting his tailored Italian suit. He looked entirely out of place in the rugged clearing, his polished leather loafers already dusted with the pale, poisoned soil he treated with such contempt. "I thought I might find you here, playing scientist," Julian sneered, stepping inside without an invitation. He didn't look at the equipment. He looked at Elena with the casual, predatory amusement of a man who believed he'd already won. "Really, Elena, you're still trying to dig up the past. I told you the bulldozers are fueled and ready. Friday is coming whether you're ready or not." "You're trespassing, Julian," Elena said, her hand instinctively tightening around the report, sliding it behind her back. "Trespassing on my own future," he laughed, a dry, entitled sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. He reached out, flicking a piece of lint off Silas's shoulder with a dismissive sneer. "I've already pre-sold the development rights to the Vance plot. A luxury wellness retreat. The irony is delicious, isn't it? Building a spa over the very dirt you used to worship." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the cloying scent of his expensive, musky cologne drowning out the clean smell of the lab. "And let's be honest about Leo. Do you really want your son growing up in a shack, smelling like compost and failure. Once the sale is finalized, I might be inclined to set up a small trust for him. A little charity for the nephew I'll never have to see. The mention of her son hit Elena like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over her. She looked at him, really looked at him, noticing the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his gold cufflink. He was over-leveraged. He was desperate. And he had no idea she was holding the one document that could dismantle his entire empire. "You speak about Leo as if you have a choice in his future," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the room. "I'm the only one with choices here," Julian snapped, his arrogance flaring into a sudden, sharp anger. He reached down, scooped a handful of dry earth from a sample tray on the counter, and let it sift through his fingers onto the floor. "This is all you are, Elena. Dirt. And by Friday sunset, I'm going to bury your little herb garden under 6 feet of concrete. Your father died a failure in this soil, and you're following right in his footsteps." Silas moved forward, his jaw set, but Elena held up a hand to stop him. She met Julian's gaze, her eyes like flint. "You think you've buried everything, Julian, but things have a way of surfacing when the rain gets heavy, and the harvest is going to be much more than you bargained for." Julian rolled his eyes, checking his platinum watch with a theatrical sigh. "Save the poetry for the breadline. You have 3 days to pack your jars. If I see a single Vance heirloom left on this property by Saturday morning, I'll personally watch the claws of the excavator tear it to pieces." He turned on his heel, the metal steps of the trailer ringing under his boots as he descended. A moment later, the high-pitched, arrogant whine of his Ferrari's engine tore through the silence of the woods, fading only when he reached the main road. Elena turned back to Silas, her face a mask of iron. The wait-for-it moment had passed. The preparation was over. "He doesn't know," Silas whispered, looking at the spilled soil on the floor. "No," Elena said, pulling the report from behind her back and smoothing it out on the lab table. "He thinks he's clearing the land for a retreat. He doesn't realize he's just spent millions of the Sterling family's remaining capital on a toxic waste site that the state is about to seize." She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over a contact she hadn't called in years. Arthur Sterling was the only one who could verify the secondary signatures on the manifests, the ones Julian had forged to keep his father in the dark. "I need to get to the estate," Elena said, her pulse drumming a steady rhythm of anticipation. "If Margaret is keeping Arthur isolated, I need to get inside before Julian realizes the lab results have been filed." As she stepped out of the trailer, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of the coming storm. She looked toward the horizon, where the Sterling mansion sat like a crown on the hill. The countdown had shifted. It wasn't just 4 days until the sale. It was 3 days until Julian Sterling realized he had signed his own confession. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen, chilling her blood instantly. "He's moving Arthur to the private facility tonight. If you want the truth, you have 2 hours." The drive to the Sterling estate took 40 minutes, leaving Elena exactly 80 minutes before the transport arrived. The iron gates groaned as they parted, a heavy, metallic sound that echoed through the valley like a warning. Elena Vance didn't slow down. She parked her battered truck on the pristine gravel circle, the vehicle's rusted frame a jagged scar against the backdrop of the white-columned mansion. The foyer was silent, smelling of expensive floor wax and the cloying, sweet scent of Margaret Sterling's jasmine perfume. Margaret stood at the base of the grand staircase, her spine a rigid line of social defiance. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes scanning Elena's worn denim jacket with visible distaste. "You shouldn't be here," Margaret said, her voice thin and sharp. "Julian is busy with the lawyers. We're finalizing the sale of the lower acreage tonight. Your presence is inconvenient." Elena didn't stop moving. The thud-clack of her boots on the marble floor was a rhythmic assault on the house's manufactured peace. "I'm not here for the sale, Margaret. I'm here for Arthur." "My husband is resting," she snapped, stepping into Elena's path. He's being moved to a facility where he can receive professional care. Something you could never provide in that trailer of yours. Elena felt the weight of the folder in her hand, the paper crisp and cold against her palm. Inside were the forged manifests Sela's thorn had helped her decode. She looked at her mother, seeing only a woman who had traded her soul for a seat at a table that was about to be overturned. He's being moved so Julian can hide the evidence of what he's done to the soil, and you're letting it happen. A door clicked open above them. Julian Sterling appeared at the top of the stairs, looking every bit the heir in a tailored navy suit that cost more than Elena's annual mortgage. He smirked, leaning over the mahogany railing with a casual, predatory grace. "Still playing the hero, Elena?" he called down, his voice dripping with condescension. "I heard you were digging around the old lab. It's a bit late for a science project, don't you think? The contracts are signed. The money moves at dawn." Elena looked up, her pulse steady despite the fury simmering in her chest. "You might want to check the secondary signatures on those manifests, Julian. The ones you thought were buried in the digital archives. They don't match the originals." Julian's smirk didn't falter, but his fingers tightened on the railing. "You've always had a vivid imagination. It's why you never fit in here. You think a few discrepancies in some old paperwork will stop me. I'm the future of the Sterling name. You're just a ghost haunting a house that doesn't want you." He started down the stairs, his pace slow and deliberate. When he reached the bottom, he stepped into Elena's personal space, the scent of his expensive cologne, something woodsy and artificial, filling the air. "And let's be honest about your motivations. You're not here for Arthur. You're here because you're jealous. You want Leo to have a piece of this life, but you know he's better off without you. Maybe I'll set up a small trust for him once I've cleared the dead weight from the estate." "It's more than you've ever given him." The insult hit like a physical blow, but Elena didn't flinch. She saw the flicker of uncertainty behind his eyes, the classic arrogance of a man who believed his own lies. She touched the brass handle of the folder again, a secret power he couldn't yet fathom. "I'm going to see him," she said, her voice a low, dangerous calm. "He won't even recognize you," Julian Sterling sneered, checking his platinum watch. "The transport team is already in the North Wing. You have 10 minutes to say goodbye to a man who's already forgotten you exist. Then security will escort you to the gate. Permanently." He turned his back on her, a dismissal intended to humiliate. Margaret followed him toward the study, her heels clicking a sharp, victorious beat. They were so certain of their win, so blinded by the glitter of the coming sale, that they didn't see the storm Elena had brought with her. She checked her own watch. 65 minutes. Elena turned toward the West Wing, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached the heavy oak doors of Arthur's suite, her hand trembling as she gripped the cold brass handle. This was the moment. If Arthur Sterling couldn't verify what she had found, Julian would win, and the truth would be buried under a private facility's clinical silence. She pushed the door open. The room was dim, the air heavy with the smell of antiseptic and old paper. In the center of the massive bed, a frail figure sat silhouetted against the window. "Arthur," she whispered. The figure didn't move at first. Then slowly the head turned. But as Elena stepped into the light, she realized she wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows by the wardrobe was a man she didn't recognize, holding a black medical bag and a syringe that caught the moonlight. "You're early," the man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The transport isn't scheduled for another hour." The evening of the Sterling Foundation gala arrived with a suffocating sense of finality. 6 hours had passed since the struggle in the West Wing. 6 hours since Sela's thorn had helped her spirit a fragile, terrified Arthur Sterling to a secure location far from Julian's reach. Now, the grand ballroom of the Sterling estate was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp tuxedos, the air thick with the cloying scent of white lilies, and the expensive, musky cologne of men who bought and sold lives over appetizers. Julian Sterling stood at the center of the room, holding court beneath the massive crystal chandelier. He looked every bit the triumphant heir, his hand wrapped around a glass of 20-year-old scotch, his laughter cutting through the refined hum of the string quartet. He was draped in a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than Elena's entire greenhouse, and he wore his arrogance like a crown. Elena Vance paused at the top of the marble staircase. She wasn't the trembling woman who had arrived weeks ago, desperate and pleading. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, her mother's vintage piece, that clung to her frame with a regal defiance. Her hair was swept up, exposing the sharp line of her jaw. She felt the cold weight of the silver locket against her collarbone, but it wasn't a memento tonight. It was a shield. Inside was the micro SD card Silas had helped her encrypt, containing the digital trail of Julian's systematic embezzlement and the environmental reports he had tried to bury. As she descended, the vibration of the cello strings seemed to hum through the very soles of her feet. She saw Margaret Sterling standing near the buffet, her face a mask of practiced porcelain perfection, studiously ignoring the way her son's eyes narrowed as Elena approached the inner circle. "You're late," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave as she reached him. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he leaned in, the smell of peat and entitlement rolling off him in waves. "I thought perhaps you'd finally taken the hint and crawled back to that dirt patch you call a home. You smell like compost and desperation, Elena. It's a bit much for a black tie affair, don't you think?" He chuckled, glancing at the two board members flanking him. They offered polite, sycophantic smiles, their eyes raking over Elena with dismissive curiosity. "I had some family business to attend to," Elena replied, her voice steady, an ice-cold contrast to his heat. She didn't flinch, she didn't look away. "Arthur sends his regards, by the way. He's feeling much more lucid this evening." Julian's grip tightened on his glass, the crystal let out a faint, ominous creak. For a fleeting second, the mask of the confident billionaire slipped, revealing a flicker of raw, jagged panic. "My father is resting under medical supervision." "You shouldn't be filling your head with delusions. It makes you look unstable." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his voice a low hiss. "Enjoy the champagne while you can. By tomorrow morning, the Vance name will be a footnote in a bankruptcy filing, and your son will be lucky if I let him keep his shoes when I clear out that shack." Elena felt a spike of pure, white-hot rage, but she channeled it into a thin, knowing smile. She reached out, her fingers grazing the lapel of his expensive suit, a gesture that looked intimate to the witnesses but felt like a brand to Julian. "You talk a lot about shoes and dirt, Julian," she whispered. "But you've forgotten what it's like to actually walk on the ground. It's much harder to keep your balance when the floor starts to shift." She pulled away before he could respond, moving toward the far end of the ballroom where Silas Thorne stood by the heavy velvet curtains. He gave her a single, sharp nod. The technical booth was ready. The guest list was a who's who of the state's regulatory boards and the Sterling family's primary investors. Every witness she needed was currently trapped in this room, fed on caviar and lies, waiting for the keynote address. The wait for it moment arrived when Julian stepped toward the mahogany podium. He signaled for silence, and the room obeyed. The quartet tapered off, leaving only the sound of 100 people breathing in anticipation. Julian looked out over the crowd, his chest expanding with the sheer intoxication of his perceived victory. "Friends, colleagues," Julian began, his voice projected with practiced charisma. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate the Sterling legacy, we celebrate the future. Tomorrow, we break ground on the Sterling Green Initiative, a project that will transform the valley and provide the resources this family needs to lead for another century." Elena watched him from the shadows of a marble pillar. She saw Margaret nodding approvingly, her diamonds catching the light. She saw the board members leaning in, ready to sign away the valley's future for a percentage of the profits. Julian looked at Elena, a predatory smirk playing on his lips as he prepared to announce the acquisition, the theft, of the Vance lands. "However," Julian continued, his tone turning mock somber, "progress requires the removal of the old to make way for the new. It's with a heavy heart that I announce the dissolution of the Vance Heritage lease." Elena felt the flash drive in her clutch purse. She looked at Silas, who was positioned behind the main projector console. The dramatic irony was a physical weight in the room. Julian thought he was delivering a eulogy for her life, unaware that he was standing on the trapdoor of his own making. "Wait," Elena said. It wasn't a shout. It was a calm, clear command that cut through Julian's oratory like a blade through silk. The room went unnervingly still. A woman in the front row gasped, her champagne glass clinking against her wedding ring. Julian stopped, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Elena, sit down. Security will escort you out if you continue this tantrum." "I think the board would prefer to see the environmental impact survey first," Elena said, stepping into the light of the center aisle. She felt the eyes of every donor and dignitary in the county locking onto her. "The real one, not the one you edited, Julian." Julian's hand went to the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. He looked at the security guards near the door, his eyes wide with a frantic, silent command to move. But Silas was already moving his hand over the controls. "The gala is just beginning," Elena said, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but the giant screen behind him suddenly flickered to life, and the first image wasn't a blueprint for a garden. It was a scanned bank ledger with Julian's signature highlighted in glowing red. The cliffhanger hung in the air as Julian turned to the screen, his mouth falling open, the first sound of a collective murmur rising from the crowd like a coming storm. The silence in the ballroom was a physical weight, thick with the cloying scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the massive LED screen. Elena Vance didn't look at the glowing display. She had memorized every pixel of that ledger during the long, sleepless nights in her small cottage. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the man at the podium. The scan document showed more than just numbers. It revealed the systematic siphoning of the Sterling Foundation's environmental trust. Millions of dollars redirected into offshore accounts to cover gambling debts that Julian Sterling thought he'd buried forever. Julian's face underwent a violent, public disintegration. The arrogant mask he'd worn for a decade didn't just slip, it shattered. His skin, usually a pampered, sun-kissed tan, curdled into a sickly shade of gray-green, like spoiled milk left in the sun. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke across his forehead, matting his perfectly styled hair into greasy clumps. His jaw hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he seemed powerless to stop. His eyes, once sharp with the predatory intent of a man who owned the world, now darted frantically toward the heavy oak exits, the pupils blown wide with the primal terror of a trapped animal. He looked suddenly, jarringly small, his designer suit appearing 2 sizes too large for a man whose very skeleton seemed to be shrinking under the weight of the room's collective judgment. A sharp, crystalline crack echoed through the vaulted hall. Margaret Sterling had let her champagne flute slip, the vintage liquid pooling around her silver heels like a spreading wound. Beside her, Arthur Sterling gripped the back of a velvet chair so hard his knuckles turned the color of bone. He stared at the screen, his breath hitching as he recognized the signature, his son's handwriting, slanted and entitled, signing away the family's honor. Silas Thorne stood near the technical booth, his arms crossed, his expression a mask of grim, scientific satisfaction. He had provided the soil samples, but Elena had provided the motive. The murmurs began then, a low-frequency hum of outrage that vibrated in the floorboards. "Is that the trust fund?" a donor whispered, the sound carrying in the unnatural stillness. "He gambled away the conservation grants." "It's a fabrication," Julian finally gasped, his voice cracking and thin, stripped of its usual baritone authority. He lunged toward the edge of the podium, but his legs seemed made of lead. He nearly tripped over the floral arrangements, looking like a drunkard in front of the county's most powerful figures. "This woman is a fraud. She's a bitter, vengeful." "I'm the woman who kept the receipts you were too arrogant to shred, Julian," Elena interrupted. Her voice, amplified by the house speakers, was steady and cold, cutting through his frantic bluster like a scalpel. She reached into her modest clutch and pulled out a small, black USB drive, holding it up so the light caught its metallic edge. "The ledger is just the paper trail. This drive contains the audio recordings of your private meetings with the waste disposal contractors. The ones where you laughed about how easy it was to dump toxins into the Vance family's groundwater, because no one cares about a bunch of dirt-poor herbalists. The room went deathly still again, a vacuum of sound that made Julian's ragged breathing audible to the front row. The sound of heavy footsteps at the back of the hall drew every eye. 2 men in dark suits, their badges glinting under the crystal chandeliers, stepped into the light. Silas had made the call an hour ago. The authorities had been waiting for the public reveal to ensure there was no way for the sterling name to buy its way out of this. Julian looked at the investigators, then back at Elena, his chest heaving. He reached out a hand, a desperate, grasping gesture, but she stepped back, moving out of his orbit entirely. "You told me I didn't belong in this world, Julian," Elena said, her words ringing clear against the marble. "You were right. I belong in a world where the land is clean and the people are honest. You, however, belong exactly where they're about to take you." Julian's voice rose into a shriek of denial as the investigators reached the stage, but the board members were already turning their backs, their faces masks of disgust. He reached for his father, but Arthur Sterling looked away, his eyes closing in shame. Elena didn't look back as she pushed through the heavy doors, but she could still hear Julian's frantic, breaking voice calling her name, a sound that was quickly cut short by the heavy thud of the ballroom doors closing him in with his consequences. The silence of the corridor felt heavy, a stark contrast to the chaos Elena had left behind the double doors. The air here was cooler, smelling of floor wax, and the faint, metallic scent of the rain beginning to lash against the tall windows at the end of the hall. Elena Vance didn't stop walking until she reached the center of the gallery, her breath hitching in her chest. She leaned one hand against the cold marble of a pedestal, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the stone. She wasn't shaking from fear, but from the sheer, electric rush of the weight finally falling away. Silas Thorne was waiting near the elevators, his silhouette dark against the city lights. He held a tablet in one hand, the screen glowing with a steady, rhythmic pulse of data. As she approached, he looked up, a grim smile touching his lips. He didn't need to ask. The muffled shouts echoing from the ballroom told the story well enough. "The regional EPA office just confirmed receipt of the digital manifest," Silas said, his voice a low, grounding rumble in the empty space. The soil samples from the Vance property matched the chemical signature of the Sterling industrial runoff perfectly. There's no ambiguity left. They've already dispatched a team to the site to secure the perimeter. Elena nodded, her gaze fixed on the elevator doors. "It's not just the land, Silas. Julian's gambling debts were tied to the shell company he used to hide the cleanup costs. He didn't just poison the water, he sold the family's future to cover his own tracks." The heavy doors at the end of the hall burst open, the sound echoing like a gunshot. 2 security guards stepped out first, followed closely by the lead investigator Elena had spoken to weeks ago. Between them, Julian Sterling looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His silk tie was yanked loose, and his hair, usually plastered into a perfect, arrogant wave, fell across his forehead in damp strands. When Julian saw her, the transformation was visceral. The arrogance that had defined his features for years didn't just fade, it curdled into something unrecognizable. His jaw, usually set in a smug, square line, hung slack, trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor that made the sweat beads on his forehead stand out like grease. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, went wide and glassy, darting toward the exits as if he could somehow phase through the solid oak doors. He looked smaller, the expensive fabric of his suit suddenly appearing 2 sizes too large for a man who had finally been stripped of his borrowed power. "You think this makes you one of us?" Julian hissed as they marched him past her. His voice was a jagged shadow of its former self, cracking with a desperate, impotent rage. "You're a gardener, Elena, a peasant playing with fire. My father will have this erased by morning. You'll be back in the dirt where you belong." "The dirt is exactly where the truth was hidden, Julian," she replied, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "And unlike you, I know how to make things grow there. You only know how to bury them." Arthur Sterling stepped into the hallway behind his son, looking every bit of his 70 years. He ignored Julian's frantic pleas, his gaze fixed solely on Elena. There was no anger in the old man's eyes, only a profound, echoing exhaustion. He looked at the handcuffs on his son's wrists, and then back to the woman he had once dismissed as a mere distraction. "I spent 40 years building a name," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. "And I spent 20 years ignoring the rot inside it because it was easier than facing what I'd raised." He turned his back on Julian, a gesture of finality that seemed to hit the younger man harder than any physical blow. Margaret Sterling followed, her sharp heels clicking against the marble in a frantic, uneven rhythm. She clutched her pearls so tightly the string looked ready to snap. "Elena, please," she gasped, her eyes darting to the investigators. "Think of the scandal. Think of Leo. He's a Sterling, too. You're destroying his inheritance." "I'm saving his soul, Margaret," Elena said, stepping toward the elevator. "I'd rather he inherit a handful of clean dirt than a mountain of poisoned gold." The investigator stepped forward, his hand firm on Julian's shoulder. "Mr. Sterling, you're being transported for formal processing. We have the warrants for the offshore accounts." Julian lunged toward Elena one last time, a mindless, desperate movement that the guards easily checked. "I gave you everything," he shrieked, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "I made you." Elena didn't look back. She stepped into the elevator with Sela's, the brushed steel doors sliding shut on Julian's fading cries. As the carriage descended, she pulled a small glass vial from her pocket, the first clean water sample Sela's had taken from the Vance well. She watched the light catch the clear liquid, a silent promise to the son waiting for her at home. The Sterling legacy was a ruin of ash and ego, but as the elevator reached the ground floor, Elena Vance felt the first true breath of spring. She walked out into the rain, leaving the giants to collapse in the dark behind her. 6 months had passed since the gilded doors of the Sterling Empire had been padlocked by federal marshals. The air at the Vance estate no longer carried the sharp, metallic tang of industrial runoff. Instead, it smelled of crushed mint and damp, healing earth. Elena Vance stood by the old stone well, watching the morning sun catch the ripples in a bucket of water she had just drawn. It was perfectly clear, a liquid diamond reflecting a sky that finally felt hers again. Sela's Thorn stood a few paces back, his boots caked in the rich, dark mud of the valley. He wasn't looking at the water, but at the woman who had brought the land back from the brink of death. He held a digital tablet, the screen displaying a sea of green data points. "The soil toxicity is down another 12%, he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there when they first met. "The lavender is taking hold in the north pasture. You did it, Elena." She offered a small, tired smile. She had the land, the legacy, and the safety of her son, but the victory felt heavy. She reached into her pocket and felt the smooth, cold surface of a silver key, the only thing she had kept from the Sterling penthouse before the liquidation. It was a reminder of the cage she had escaped. The scene shifted an hour later to the sterile, white-walled silence of the St. Jude's intensive care unit. The atmosphere here was a stark contrast to the vibrant life of the farm. It smelled of bleach and impending endings. Arthur Sterling lay in the center of the bed, his frame so diminished that he seemed to disappear beneath the bleached sheets. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator was the only sound in the room, a cold metronome counting down his final hours. Margaret Sterling sat in a plastic chair in the corner, her hands trembling as she clutched a handbag that was 3 seasons out of style. Without her designer armor and the social standing of the Sterling name, she looked fragile, her skin like parchment paper. She didn't look up when the door opened. She didn't have the strength left to pretend. A moment later, the heavy thud of a guard's boots echoed in the hallway. Julian Sterling entered the room, his wrists bound by steel cuffs that glinted cruelly under the fluorescent lights. The transition was jarring. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with a flick of his wrist was now a shadow in a coarse, orange jumpsuit. His hair was shorn close to his scalp, and the arrogance that had once defined his face had been replaced by a frantic, hollow-eyed desperation. He stumbled toward the bed, the chain between his ankles rattling. "Dad," he rasped, his voice cracking. He didn't look at his mother, nor did he acknowledge Elena standing by the window. He looked only at the dying man, the source of the power he had squandered on gambling and ego. "You have to tell them. Tell the lawyers I didn't mean for it to go this far. Tell them it was an accident." Even at the threshold of death, Julian was still bargaining. He wasn't mourning a father, he was mourning a benefactor. Arthur's eyes fluttered open, cloudy and distant. He ignored the son who had bankrupted his soul. His gaze drifted past the orange jumpsuit, past the weeping woman in the corner, and landed on Elena. With a trembling hand, he reached out. She took it, her fingers closing over his cold, papery skin. "The well," Arthur whispered, the words barely a ghost of a sound. "Is it clear?" "It's perfect, Arthur," she replied softly. "The water is pure." A single tear tracked through the deep lines of the old man's face. He squeezed her hand once, a silent apology for 40 years of silence and a final validation of the daughter he had nearly let be destroyed. Then the monitor emitted a long, flat tone that tore through the room like a siren. Julian let out a strangled, animalistic cry, falling to his knees as the guard stepped forward to pull him away. He shrieked about his inheritance, about the unfairness of it all, his face contorting into a mask of pure, impotent rage. He was dragged from the room, his heels dragging on the linoleum, a man who had traded his family for a throne of ash. Elena walked out of the hospital into the cooling afternoon air. She found Silas waiting by the truck, Leo Vance sitting in the passenger seat, kicking his legs and humming a quiet tune. Her son looked up, his eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy of a child who knew he was going home to a place where the grass was safe to run on. She looked back at the towering glass hospital wing one last time. She had won. The Sterlings were gone, their name a footnote in a fraud investigation, their fortune dissolved into legal fees and restitution. But as she climbed into the truck and felt the vibration of the engine, she felt the sting of what it had cost. She had saved the land, but she had lost the father she had only just begun to know. She put the truck in gear and drove toward the valley, leaving the ruins of the giants behind her in the rearview mirror, moving toward a future that was humble, quiet, and finally, truly clean.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.